Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who wants access to my yard. I'll never forget the moment I stepped out of my house on that crisp Saturday morning, somewhere in the early days of autumn, feeling as though I had finally gotten a handle on life as a temporary solo homeowner. My husband had traveled to another continent for a 6-month business trip, and I was more or less left in charge of everything: the yard, repairs, that tricky HVAC system that always chose the worst possible time to break down, and maintaining friendly ties with the neighbors. Or at least, that's what I thought before my illusions of tranquil homeownership were shattered by Karen. Karen has lived in this neighborhood for about a year longer than me, and I initially thought she was the friendliest, most helpful soul around. She'd wave politely when we passed each other in our cul-de-sac, occasionally comment on the color of my yard plants, and never once complained about my dog's barking, even though I worried he was too loud for those early morning walks. I guess it's safe to say that I took that easy smile of hers at face value. Little did I know it would morph into something else, a sense of entitlement that bordered on audacious. Now I have a modest single-family home in a gated community. I'll call the neighborhood Crestview Estates. We moved here because it's safe, quiet, and the HOA, while a bit strict, does keep the area clean and secure. My property has a driveway large enough for 2 cars and a spare spot off to the side near the front gate. It's technically on my land, which is why it's behind a special coded gate that leads directly onto my property. It's not community property. It's entirely private, and I like having that bit of separation from the main street. My husband and I love how protected it feels, and he always jokes that if any burglar wanted in, they'd have to solve my puzzle locks because I have a passcode and also a physical padlock on the side gate. Of course, we've never had any incidents. Until Karen. A few months ago, right after my husband left on his lengthy trip, Karen started dropping little hints about how nice it must be to have all that extra parking space and no one to fill it. She didn't say it outright, but she'd mentioned that her sister might visit or that her friend's car might be in need of somewhere to park for a short while. Each time I gave a polite smile and changed the subject. Although I didn't love the idea of a random car parked on my property, I did appreciate that she asked. I assumed that was the end of it, some neighborly curiosity that would fade. How naive I was. A couple of weeks later, Karen's approach changed. She rang my doorbell around mid-morning. I was in the middle of cleaning the garage, so I answered with my hair tied up in a messy bun and my hands covered in dust. She wore her usual pastel blouse and white capri pants, her nails perfectly manicured, and her expression oddly bright for someone who'd apparently marched over to talk business. Without so much as a hello, she gestured toward my gate. "I notice you keep that gate locked," she remarked, her tone more inquisitive than confrontational. "Do you mind if I get the code? It would be so much easier for me to park my car in that extra space, seeing as your husband's away." I stood there, baffled by her boldness, but forced a gentle smile. "I'm sorry, Karen, but that's private property. I keep it locked for a reason. My husband and I prefer it that way, especially now that he's away." She gave me a little shrug, the corners of her mouth twitching into a condescending grin. "But think about it. You don't use that space much, right?" she persisted. "I hate having to leave my car on the main road where passing trucks could scratch it. It's not like you're using the spot, and I'm sure it won't hurt to share," I repeated a bit more firmly. "Sorry, but no, that space belongs to me. I'd like to keep it secure." I decided not to engage further, so I politely excused myself and went back into the house. When I glanced out the window, I saw her standing on the sidewalk, arms folded, glaring at that gate like it had personally insulted her. That, I assumed, was the end of the matter. About 2 days later, I got a typed letter stuck in my mailbox. It had no official letterhead, no signature, just a statement declaring how selfish I was being by not allowing other community members to make use of underutilized real estate. The letter ended with a vague threat about how the HOA will not appreciate your lack of neighborly spirit. I recognized the overly formal scolding style as Karen's. She occasionally wrote those passive-aggressive notes about garbage bins left on the curb. However, this time, she'd clearly misstepped, because she was referencing my private property, not a shared sidewalk. Moreover, she was threatening to involve the HOA over something they absolutely had no jurisdiction over. I had to stifle a laugh. Nonetheless, I decided to document the letter because I'm not one to risk a meltdown with the HOA. I'd read our community guidelines thoroughly when we bought this place. My husband made me the designated fine print person, and I had a thorough knowledge of what the HOA could and couldn't do. I was fairly certain they couldn't mandate access to my personal gate. Still, I scanned the letter into my computer. Then I wrote an email to the HOA board's official address, attaching the letter and politely inquiring if they had indeed sanctioned such a notice. As expected, they replied with confusion. They hadn't sent it, nor had anyone on their official committee. In fact, our property manager, Linda, assured me she would never authorize forcing a homeowner to grant access to private property. Linda did note, however, that Karen had brought up the subject at the last monthly meeting, apparently complaining that gated driveways create an eyesore and that they impede community harmony. She was summarily told by the HOA that they have no right to demand a gate be opened or shared unless it was a direct hazard or violation of the aesthetic guidelines. My gate is well within the rules, so that was that, or so I thought. But no, Karen wasn't done. The next development came about a week later, on a windy evening, just as I was settling in to watch one of my favorite old TV shows. My dog started barking like mad at the front door, so I hurried over, thinking maybe it was an unexpected delivery. Instead, I saw Karen outside, rattling the gate and shouting, "Open up! I can't believe you're locking me out of a perfectly good space when my car's at risk of vandalism." She must have seen me through the window because she doubled down, yelling even louder that the HOA would fine me for not being cooperative, that she could easily claim the spot was a shared driveway, and so on. Frankly, I was exhausted. I really didn't want to engage, but the clanking was so loud it was attracting other neighbors. I stepped outside, adrenaline rushing, and calmly asked her to step away from my property and stop causing a scene. "Karen," I said, my voice cracking slightly from annoyance, "this is private property. You cannot just barge in here. And for the record, no, you can't have my code." She started to argue, but then some other neighbor, a nice older gentleman named Harold, came out to see what was going on. He walked over, gave Karen the sternest look I've ever seen from him, and told her that he'd personally vouched that the gate and the driveway belonged to me and that she was stepping on private land. Karen turned beet red, mumbled something about minding his own business, and walked off. I thanked Harold, who chuckled and said, "Don't let her bully you." I was relieved to have a bit of support from at least one fellow resident. But Karen was resilient in her stubbornness. She started texting me, which was bewildering because I didn't recall ever giving her my phone number. My best guess is that she got it from an outdated neighborhood phone list the HOA circulated for emergencies. Her messages escalated from mild annoyance, "Hey, you sure I can't get that code? I promise not to disturb you," to borderline harassment. "Your refusal is petty. I know your husband's away. That space is wide open. Are you afraid of me?" Then came the calls, voicemails claiming I'd be sorry if I didn't let her park, that I might face serious repercussions, and how the HOA was on her side. I saved every single voicemail and screenshot. All the while, I was juggling my own personal life. My husband was sending postcards from the other side of the world, describing a hectic schedule and the possibility of an extended stay. Meanwhile, my mother was battling some health issues back in another state, so I was traveling to see her periodically. I'd drive back and forth, feeling a knot of stress in my stomach because I never knew what I'd come home to. More than once, I found suspicious footprints by my gate lock, as though someone had tested the latch or tried a code. My security camera, set up high above the garage, caught Karen lurking near the gate on multiple occasions. I turned these recordings over to the HOA and told them that I wasn't accusing them of anything, but I wanted to keep them informed. They replied with a brief statement that they would monitor the situation, but I suspect they had no formal mechanism to punish Karen unless she damaged something or trespassed in a way that was obviously criminal. Then, one evening, something truly unsettling happened. I came home from an overnight trip to find my lock partially jammed with what looked like glue. The gate was still shut, but the code box had sticky residue all over the keypad. It took me about an hour of carefully cleaning to get it working again. As you might imagine, I was furious. I had no absolute proof that Karen had done it, but given her repeated demands and that aggravating letter, I had strong suspicions. I documented everything: photos of the damage, the receipt for the new lock I ended up purchasing, the camera footage that showed Karen skulking around a few days before. I considered contacting law enforcement, but it felt like a gray area. The damage wasn't massive, and I wasn't sure if they'd do anything besides take a statement. Before I could decide, Karen made her next move. I received a supposed fine notice in the mail with a letter that looked remarkably official, except that the address of the HOA office was spelled incorrectly. It demanded that I pay a fee of a few $100s for failing to comply with community guidelines regarding shared driveway usage. Well, the second I saw that phrase, my anger turned to a determined calm. I knew from experience that the HOA guidelines did not label any portion of my driveway as shared. The letter was obviously a forgery, and not even a particularly good one. The biggest giveaway, aside from the misspelling, was the fact that the official HOA letter would normally have the current president's signature. This one was just typed out with no name at the bottom, followed by an old logo that I recognized from 3 years prior. I took immediate action. I wrote a lengthy email to the actual HOA, forwarding them a scanned copy of the letter and stating that I was experiencing harassment from Karen, who was forging official documents. I also told them about the glue incident and attached the camera footage screen captures, along with the timeline of her repeated attempts to demand my gate code. The next day, I followed up with a phone call to Linda, the property manager. She sounded both outraged and exasperated. She said that this was crossing a line from an internal neighbor dispute into territory that might be considered fraud. She recommended that I contact law enforcement and forward them a complaint about false representation. That's when I decided it was time to stop trying to handle Karen's nonsense on my own. I spoke with a friend of mine, Macy, who works in a local attorney's office. Macy advised me that forging an official document could land Karen in serious trouble, especially if the HOA was willing to confirm the forgery. If the letter demanded money, that edged dangerously close to extortion. Encouraged by Macy's input, I filed a police report, providing all the evidence of harassment, trespass attempts, property damage, and forgery. The officer I spoke with took it seriously, especially once I showed him the letter and the time-stamped footage of Karen rattling my gate and making threats. He said they would follow up by speaking to her directly. A couple of days passed without incident. Then, one afternoon, I saw a police cruiser pull up outside Karen's house. She later told me, yelled at me in the street, more accurately, that the police had the nerve to question her over something so trivial. She claimed she had no idea what they were talking about, but clearly she was rattled. That same day, Linda from the HOA called me to confirm that they were launching their own internal inquiry into whether Karen was involved in forging that letter. If it was proven she'd impersonated the HOA, she could face stiff fines from the association itself and possible legal consequences. Though Karen's intimidation tactics had lessened, it wasn't the end of my saga. There was an upcoming HOA meeting, one of the bigger annual ones, open to all community residents. I decided to attend. I typically avoided those gatherings unless something concerned me, but this time, I was determined to set the record straight in person. When I arrived at the clubhouse, I noticed Karen was already there, sitting near the front in a pristine outfit. She watched me with narrowed eyes as I took a seat behind a few neighbors who gave me sympathetic nods. The meeting began with the usual agenda items: budget updates, landscaping guidelines, scheduling for community-wide yard cleanups. Then Linda, who was chairing the discussion, brought up the matter of unauthorized property usage and reminded everyone of the rules about private driveways. She diplomatically didn't mention Karen by name, but I could see that half the people in the room already knew the story. Once Linda finished, I raised my hand and calmly announced that I had been facing repeated harassment over my private gate and that a forged document had been sent to me in an attempt to scare me into paying a false fine. I explained that law enforcement was involved and that while I didn't want to make any direct accusations, I believed it was important for the community to be aware of the issue. Karen's face turned redder than I'd ever seen. She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking her chair to the floor, and launched into a tirade about how certain residents were hoarding space that could otherwise make the neighborhood more convenient. She insisted that her forging the letter was a baseless allegation and that I was using my husband's absence as a way to concoct a sob story. The meeting devolved into a bit of chaos, with neighbors chiming in about their own experiences with private property, forging documents, or dealing with false HOA claims. Linda repeatedly had to call for order. Finally, one of the HOA board members, a level-headed guy named Ed, said that it was absolutely against the rules for anyone to demand access to someone else's private property. He reiterated that forging or tampering with official HOA paperwork was a serious offense. Karen, either unable to come up with a coherent defense or simply too furious, grabbed her purse and stormed out. That night, I expected more drama. Instead, I got radio silence for nearly 2 weeks. No texts, no calls, Not even an angry note on my door. It was eerily quiet. My gate, newly fitted with a more tamper-resistant lock and keypad, remained undisturbed. In a way, I was relieved, but a small part of me was anxious, waiting for the next shoe to drop. In the interim, I decided to occupy my thoughts with a few side projects. First, I committed to a long-postponed landscaping project in my backyard, planting new flower beds, setting up a small vegetable garden, and installing motion sensor lights by the side gate. Second, I got more involved with a local community group that planned volunteer events, partially to distract myself from the stress. Through that group, I made a new friend, Ingrid, who lived a few blocks away. Ingrid had her own run-in with Karen over a completely different issue. Apparently, Karen had complained about the color of Ingrid's garage door, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. It did not. Ingrid ended up painting it slightly darker than before just to avoid confrontation. So Karen's pattern of overreaching was not isolated to my situation. Ingrid's story only cemented in my mind how important it was to stand my ground. Eventually, the tension came to a boil. One afternoon, I heard a shrill yell outside. When I looked out the window, I saw Karen and a stranger, who I later learned was a visiting cousin or friend of hers, standing near the gate again. Karen was pointing aggressively at the lock. I stepped out onto my porch, phone in hand, ready to record if needed. Her visitor, looking uncomfortable, was trying to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. Karen demanded, "You have to let me park here. My relative's car is parked all the way down the street. This is ridiculous. The HOA told me they don't have the power to force you, but I know they're wrong." I simply replied, "Karen, this is not shared property. You were told multiple times you can't park here. Please leave my property." She then pulled out a piece of paper, waved it in the air, and shouted, "I have the community guidelines. It says right here, no personal structures or obstructions that impede community members' access to shared utilities. Your gate is an obstruction." I rolled my eyes, recognizing that line from the HOA guidelines. She had obviously snipped out a random sentence that refers to blocking communal meters or utility boxes. My property has none of those in the driveway, so it was a completely irrelevant rule. I told her that if she continued to disturb me, I'd have to contact the police again. She let out a frustrated hiss and stormed off with her visitor trailing behind, looking mortified. That evening, I prepared myself for a possible confrontation by printing out the relevant sections of the HOA guidelines that explicitly stated the difference between private property and common areas. I also made sure my newly installed motion sensor lights were operational. Sure enough, not long after dusk, those lights flashed on, triggered by movement near the gate. I peeked out, phone ready to call the police. It was Karen once more, apparently thinking she could tamper with the lock while I slept. The bright beam of the motion sensor must have startled her because she jumped back, and I called out from the window, "I've got you on camera." She spun around, yelled something unintelligible, and ran back across the street. That was my last straw. The next morning, I marched down to the local police station with the updated footage. The officer, who by now recognized me from the prior report, listened attentively. I told him how this had been escalating for weeks, maybe months. He nodded, took notes, and said they'd be following up with Karen again, this time making it clear that further trespassing attempts could lead to charges. He also suggested I consider a restraining order if it continued. A couple of days later, I got a call from Linda. She told me the HOA had officially concluded Karen's letter was indeed a forgery. They were imposing a substantial fine on Karen for misrepresenting the HOA and for repeated attempts to violate the community guidelines. Linda sounded almost relieved to be able to take some action at last. She said that, in addition, Karen was on very thin ice with the board, and any additional complaints of harassment or property violations could lead to legal action supported by the HOA. I thanked Linda profusely for her help. Less than a week after that, I saw a moving truck in front of Karen's house. Rumors spread quickly that she was putting the place on the market. Some said she had decided she couldn't tolerate living in a community that didn't understand neighborly cooperation. Others speculated that the combination of potential criminal charges, a new HOA fine, and an overall tarnished reputation in the neighborhood was too much for her. Either way, it seemed she was preparing to move out. I didn't rejoice right away because I've learned that real estate transactions can take time, and she was still physically present for the time being. However, the atmosphere around my home felt less tense, as though the neighborhood collectively breathed a sigh of relief. Amusingly, in the days that followed, A few neighbors approached me privately to share their own Karen stories. One woman named Jocelyn said Karen had once tried to forbid her from throwing a backyard birthday party, citing made-up noise ordinances. But when Jocelyn checked with the HOA, no such rule existed. Another neighbor, Dan, claimed Karen had typed up a suspicious note about the color of his fence that turned out to be entirely bogus. It all underscored a pattern of bizarre, controlling behavior that had escalated in my case simply because I had something Karen wanted: a private parking spot behind a locked gate. Finally, about 3 weeks after the moving truck sighting, I got word through the grapevine that Karen had closed on her sale. On the day she left, I watched from my living room window as the moving van pulled away. Her car followed behind, no longer brandishing that condescending wave in my direction. For the first time since my husband went abroad, I felt a wave of complete relief. Of course, that wasn't quite the end of my story. The police case regarding the forgery was still open at that point, with Karen as a suspect. I'd made it clear I would cooperate with any follow-up, but once she left, the fuss largely died down. The HOA fine apparently was never appealed by Karen. Whether she ended up paying it out of the proceeds from her house sale or negotiated it some other way, I never found out. As for the letter forgery investigation, I heard from Macy that there was a chance the district attorney might press charges if they had enough evidence, but I was never called to testify. Maybe Karen took a plea bargain or the matter was resolved quietly. I could only guess. Through it all, I learned a valuable lesson about standing up for my rights, even when it feels uncomfortable. If I had caved the first time Karen asked me for that gate code, I might have saved myself some short-term stress, but I would have lost my sense of control over my own property. Over time, it only would have escalated as she discovered she could walk all over me. Instead, by documenting every incident, seeking legal advice, and working with the HOA, I managed to protect my interests without resorting to anything unethical or dramatic on my end. Now, with Karen gone and a new family moving into her old house, the neighborhood feels friendlier than ever. Linda even organized a small block party to welcome the newcomers, and the tension that once pervaded the street has vanished. Harold, my sweet neighbor who once stepped in to vouch for me, has become a closer friend. We share gardening tips and occasionally trade baked goods. Ingrid, who once changed her garage door color due to Karen's criticism, jokes that she might paint it purple just to celebrate the fact that no one can bully her anymore. In a curious twist, the new neighbor who replaced Karen asked me about the gate once. Out of pure fascination, they wanted to know if it was an HOA requirement. I laughed and said, "No, it's just my preference for security. And no, you can't have the code." That was a joke, of course, and they laughed too. It was a pleasant and easy conversation, a stark contrast to the confrontations I endured before. And my husband? He's still away on business, though the 6 months are nearly up. He's been catching up on my adventures through our long phone calls. At first, he was horrified to hear the drama I was going through, but then he was proud of how I handled myself. He teased me that maybe I should become a lawyer. I told him the only things I'm an expert in now are documenting property disputes and installing advanced gate locks. The experience might sound surreal, but it's taught me that neighborly disputes can take on a life of their own if you're not careful. Sometimes people just want something they can't have. In Karen's case, that something was a safe parking space on property that was mine, not hers. I refused to let her walk all over me, and in the end, she faced the consequences of her own actions: HOA fines, police scrutiny, a tarnished reputation, and ultimately having to sell her place to escape a community that had grown tired of her antics. There were times I worried that I was overreacting or being too harsh, but every step of the way, Karen escalated her behavior, forging letters, tampering with locks, and basically proving that I wasn't imagining things. If there's a moral to this story, it's that standing your ground, backed up by the right paperwork and a calm but firm demeanor, can pay off. You don't have to shout or start an all-out war. In my experience, documenting everything meticulously and involving the proper authorities is the best approach. The outcome might not be immediate. There were many sleepless nights when I wondered if Karen would try something drastic, but eventually her lies and intimidation tactics caught up with her. Life is quieter now. I still have my camera installed and I still keep my gate locked. I've replaced that old code and padlock with a newer model, just in case. Part of me is more cautious about handing out personal information, including my phone number, to neighbors. Yet, I'm not jaded. I still believe in being friendly and supportive. I refuse to let one person's entitlement rob me of the sense of community I value. I do find myself chuckling whenever I see the private drive sign on my gate, thinking back on how much trouble that small stretch of concrete caused me. It's a bit comedic in hindsight, how Karen convinced herself that she had some inherent right to my property simply because she disliked parking on the main road. But comedic or not, it was a real battle for me, one that reminded me of the importance of boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. My husband is due home next month, and I can't wait to see the look on his face when he sees the upgraded security system and the thriving new garden. Maybe we'll sit on our porch swing one evening, watch the sun set over the quiet street, and laugh about the time I faced down the dreaded driveway thief who tried to pry open my gate. It's a story I'll likely tell at parties for years, partly because it's so outrageous that people are certain to ask, "No way, did that really happen?" And I'll grin and say, "Believe it. Entitlement knows no bounds." But for now, I'm content in my little fortress, proud of myself for not giving in. Occasionally, I'll catch a glimpse of that battered old note she left in my mailbox. Yes, I kept a copy for posterity, and it never fails to remind me that some folks just can't take no for an answer. Still, I stood my ground, and I'm confident that if my story helps even one person realize they have the right to protect their space, then all those months of hassle were worth it. After all, we shouldn't have to open our gates to anyone who demands it, especially when they try to bully their way in with phony fines and threats of HOA wrath. Now, as I wrap up this account of how Karen tried and failed to seize my private parking space, I look back and realize it's more than just a tale of property disputes. It's a reminder of how easily people can cross lines when they think they're entitled. It's also a testament to the power of proper documentation, calm perseverance, and the ability to say a resolute no when someone tries to bully you into submission. I stuck to my guns, and the system, both the HOA and law enforcement, eventually backed me up. Yes, Karen tried to bully me. Yes, she tried to present forged letters and even tampered with my lock. And yes, I had to chase her away more times than I'd like to recall. But in the end, she reaped what she sowed. She faced fines, police scrutiny, and such an uncomfortable living situation that she felt compelled to move out. I suppose you could say justice was served in a fittingly thorough way. And that, my friends, is how I managed to protect my private property, uphold my rights, and send Karen packing. Sometimes you just have to stand firm, even when it feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. Believe me, it's worth it. Friends, thank you. See you soon.